This is Voices in Validation, brought to you by IVT Network. IVT Network is your expert source for life science regulatory knowledge. Voices in Validation brings you the best in validation and compliance topics. We interview industry experts from pharma, biotech, med devices, and laboratories. Here is the host of Voices in Validation, Stacey.
Thank you, and welcome to another episode of Voices in Validation. This week, we are excited to bring you again our series, Risk Revolution, which is, of course, part of the Voices in Validation podcast brought to you by IVT Network. So the goal of this series, as you remember, is to advance the maturity and risk management practices within industry by covering topics that challenge quality professionals to seek opportunities to improve and advance the ways in which they perceive and manage risk. This week, our series coordinator, Nuala, is joined once again by Valerie Mulholland for a no-holds-barred Ask Me Anything session on what's hot and new in quality risk management. So welcome to both of you. I love the idea of having an industry update. So spectacular.
Thanks a lot, Stacey. As always, it's great to be back here and to have my dear friend and colleague Val back with us again to discuss what's shaking and moving in the world of QRM this fall. So for the loyal Risk Revolution listener out there, you might remember that Val was with us earlier in the year for one of the New Year episodes and talked us through the case for improved formality in QRM decision making, and to share her take on seeking the diamonds. So we'll link to that earlier podcast in the show notes. So Val, welcome.
Thanks, Nuala, and thanks, Stacey, for having me again. Because Nuala and I are chatting all the time. We don't need a podcast to do it. And it was actually just recently we were talking about, how relevant this podcast is, because there was a time when there was very little change. Regulatory science was a little bit of a pedestrian science, and even in the 15 years since ICHQ9 was issued, I mean, we saw kind of an incremental creep of references to QRM and RM, and they were becoming increasingly prevalent as regulations and guidance documents were updated and issued. Of course, we see them creeping incrementally up in the findings and regulatory citations as well. But anyway, here we are in 2021, and it's all far from pedestrian. It's coming hard and fast. We have an update due to ICHQ9. We have ICHQ12 coming down the tracks also on post-approval change, and QRM is pivotal and foundational to availing of the reliefs and the advantages of ICHQ12. So it's a great time to do an AMA and Ask Me Anything episode of the Risk Revolution. Very good juncture.
Yeah. Well, great. I'm really looking forward to this evening's discussion, Val. So thanks for joining us. So let's get started and dive right in with the hottest news in town, which is the ICHQ9 revision. Obviously, originally published in 2005, but we saw the concept paper for the revision emerge a year ago now, can you believe, in November 2020. November is always a busy month for ICH in terms of publications, and stating that the benefits of QRM as originally envisaged within the ICHQ9 document have not yet been fully realized. So there was a recognition there that we didn't hit the board in terms of the long jump with Q9 and with QRM in the industry. And so they've structured their concept document around 4 key areas of improvement for the application of QRM. And of course, before we kick off, we should mention, full disclosure, that the rapporteur for this update, we're very proud of him, our dear friend and research associate, Dr. Kevin O'Donnell, of the Irish regulator, the HPRA, and the regulatory chairman, I note, is Alex Veman from FDA, again, a colleague of mine with the quality metrics initiative that we've worked on for a number of years. So Val, could you step us through some of the key changes that they've proposed in the concept document that we have in front of us?
Of course. And as you said, Nuala, there are 4 key areas that they're going to clarify for us, I think. One may be on the further application of QRM, I would suggest, and maybe 3 then related to how we approach QRM. So the one on the application is around product availability risks. And I suppose it's recognizing that growing discussion there is around, the impact supply chain and product availability has on patients. There's no point in making good medicine and then not being available to the patient at the end of the day. So, they see a role for QRM in maybe assuring that, risks that may lead to a loss of product availability are identified and are embraced in the PQS and are managed and assessed through QRM. And I think this is really, really timely when we look at all the supply chain issues around COVID and the global challenges with supplies. I think this is a really important and informative expectation. The other 3 areas then are in relation to the practice of QRM. So the first is the old chestnut about formality. And, you have talked about this before. I know when you mentioned briefly at the start, the paper I wrote about formality in relation to decision-making. It's one of the principles enshrined in chapter 1 of the GMPs is, that the formality should reflect, the level of formality should reflect the level of risk. But what we mean by that has always been, open to debate. And in fact, as you're talking about Dr. O'Donnell there at the outset, in 2020, mid-2020, he produced a paper in IVT with our other research colleague, Ghada Haddad, and some practitioners of QRM from MSD Merck and Jazz Pharmaceuticals. And they, in that paper, looked at all the different definitions of formality that had been discussed across, conferences and groups and discussions. And even then, having analysed all that, they boiled it down to 5 potential definitions, which were not related to each other. They range from anything that, formality might mean you executed every box on that flow diagram. And I know, Nuala, that's a pet topic of yours, moving beyond box 2. To maybe the fact that if you pull together a multifunctional team, maybe that's formality. But my personal favorite was, using data to drive the risk assessment, basing it on data. So I think that paper in particular might be important to share with our listeners, because I think that will inform the group a lot in terms of formality. The third subject, then, you have talked about this a lot and on this podcast also, so you're bang on trend, which is subjectivity. And I know you've talked about heuristics and biases and the challenges of that and the impact that has on quality risk management if it's not managed. And the fourth area is my own pet subject, as you know, which is decision-making, risk-based decision-making, and again, some clarity on what that means. That term is used a lot, but, it's conflated. It's used in different contexts with slightly different meanings. And just to define exactly what that means, I think. So we've got, 4 exciting areas. I think it's fair to say, and it's clear that, between the 3 practical areas anyway, the focus is going to be on science, on evidence, on decisions being made with information. Because I've actually never seen a risk assessment with references that indicate the data sources on which it's based. I've never seen a likelihood of occurrence and a footnote saying this is based on the, from 2010 to 2020 or something, and therefore when you look at risk assessments, you don't even know how current they are,
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot we're going to learn from this update.
Yeah, and they're going to talk, I mean, they're talking about providing practical examples. That's one of the key things that they're talking about providing. So we will wait with bated breath to see those. We really hope they are, useful examples that people can relate to. They also talk, thankfully, about some training materials being provided, because I think that that's a big gap. A lot of what's out there in terms of QRM training is very Q9, here's what the regulation says, and this is what an FMEA looks like. And don't get me started on that in terms of learning outcomes. So we hope that as this draft progresses through its work plan, that we're going to see lots of opportunity to influence that, and discussion about that in public forums, at conferences, and an opportunity to comment on the guide as it comes through. Interestingly, I mean, I am just such a believer in, the two of these are very interrelated for me, yes, which is that level of formality around that kind of good data and hard facts and good science. And the problem of subjectivity. And we can eliminate a huge amount of subjectivity if we stop basing our opinion, our decisions based on subject matter expert opinion, and in every case, that if we have no other recourse, where we have no data to back us up, we have no comparative data set for another product that operates similarly along using the same technologies, that we can use, and we have to rely on subject matter experts. That's fine, but we then should be ranking those risks higher, because it's based on opinion, and perhaps even poorly informed opinion, in my experience of some subject matter experts, rather than hard facts and good data. And that's the bottom line. Like you say, we should be able to see in any of our tools, never mind the FMEA, which I still believe we're not grown up enough to use properly. But even if we're using very simple checklists in that lower level area of maturity, or formality, then we should be able to say, we're basing this assessment of risk, of whether that's probability of occurrence or severity or otherwise, but we're basing that on the basis of the past 100 batches or something, that we can see where that data is coming from. So for me, it's all about hard facts and good data. That's how you make a good decision. And of course, you want people who are well informed and have experience there. But equally, in this risk-based decision-making space, what we don't often have is the skills around critical thinking, of questioning rather than assuming, and all of those soft skills that need to go with those good risk-based decisions. So that's a quick run through on the four key topics. What can industry expect, do you think? Do we agree with this outline? Is it ambitious enough? Is it pushing the boundary enough? Seeing as we only seem to get a piece of the pie every 15 years, are we happy that their expectations are grand enough? And are there any points missing that you would have hoped to have seen around advancing the maturity of risk management within the industry?
I think there are two.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think there are two, minor points in there that they hope to address, though they may address them in training materials. And I think it's unfortunate that they're not more central. One is that these documents would be live and living and constantly updated, and I think that's something that has been much discussed, and again, that you have referred to. And the second one is knowledge management. I think a greater tie-in with knowledge management, which is, just to summarize the point you made there, I think that's very important. But, yes, it could have gone further, and I think it's a pity it didn't go further. But at the same time, I think overall, the dots are starting to join, between all the ICH documents and the kind of the wave of expectations that are coming through. When we look to ICH Q12, for example, we know we're not going to avail of the freedoms and the reliefs in ICH Q12 if we continue to operate as though opinion-based and ideas-driven operations. We are going to have to show and demonstrate that we can, measure things accurately, that we can analyze those measurements, interpret them knowledgeably, and, that we can sow the means to harvest information to support our strategic objectives, whether they're improvement or innovation. And here we may have to collaborate as an industry, particularly when things are novel and new and innovative. One operation may not have enough data on which to make, the type of decisions we need to make around technologies. So, we may see more industry coming together, more data compiled together. We can, have a better read of early signals of how to manage innovative approaches and innovative technologies. If we enrich our database and enrich our signals. I really enjoyed listening to your recent guest, Karen Grimsby. She had it in a nutshell. She was data, and I think that is very true,
Yeah, no, for sure. Karen really put us on the pin of our collar saying, why do we need to be special all the time? Two other areas that I would have liked to see, and maybe they'll pull through in the examples and in the training, is, where's the patient in this? I know we saw that thing around product availability, which obviously gives that nod to making sure that we don't have drug shortages and our patients aren't left wanting. But when I talk about patient-focused risk management, in a lot of the sessions that I do, I sometimes get blank looks from some of the engineers and scientists in the room that they just don't feel their connection to the patient. They're a qualification or validation engineer, and they're so far down the food chain that they part of their orientation week was they found out the name of the drug that they're working on. But apart from that, they don't really feel that connection. Now, folks who are involved in the manufacturing and the supply may feel closer, but it's some of the work that I do all the time with organizations is about making that patient real, because that's the way in which the people who have the biggest influence in the short-term outcomes of the product and the long-term outcomes of the patient can surface those issues proactively. And that's the second point, that I saw one line in the back end of the concept document that said there is a need to shift the QRM focus from reactive to proactive, and that will enable continual improvement to become a key aspect within the PQS. Well, again, we've had ICH Q10 talking about continual improvement and innovation since 2008, and we're still struggling with that as an industry. So I see an awful lot of reactive risk management still happening in the industry. It's when the fire is blazing, somebody pulls out the risk assessment tool. And I would like to see a lot more proactive risk reduction and risk prevention. And I hope that this guidance, evaluates the benefit of that to the business. Much cheaper to avoid issues than to try and mitigate them after they've happened. So look, that's ICH Q9, a whistle-stop tour through ICH Q9. Any other thoughts from your side, Val?
Well, I know, and this is something I heard you talking to Karen about as well, just to reference back to that, was the matter of ISO divergence. And you said there, we're special. So, that idea that we're moving away from where the rest of the world is, following those ISO standards. And I'm inclined to agree with Karen on that space. I think she asked a very good question. She's asking, why are we diverging from those, mainline standards, I suppose. And she was particularly raising the point in connection with ICH Q10. But I think it's a very relevant point in relation to ICH Q9 as well. And I published a paper last year, I think, on that, the question of convergence, and maybe we'd share that one too.
Yeah,
but
sure, it's in the notes.
We're wallpapering this podcast with my links to my papers. But anyway, I was looking at it through the lens of manufacturing operations, where there are, we're trying to control and manage our processes and the risks to our products through QRM. But we are converging with products that are the outputs of other industries. that also rely on risk management. I mean, for example, the computerized systems we work with and integrate into our processes, those softwares and hardwares and networks and clouds, they've been risk managed through and quality controlled through ISO standards. The robotics, which have the potential to contribute so much to contamination control in our operations, they're developed with ISO risk controls. We spoke of data and the ability to, gather and mine it through AIs, etc. I mean, internationally recognized standards will be used to develop the quality of those technologies as well. So if we want to use emerging technologies and ensure ourselves that they're developed properly, then we are going to be leveraging those risk assessments, those risk management approaches to the development of those quality products. And, we can't repeat that analysis in an informed manner. We're not experts in those technologies. And if we're to integrate them to our risk management, process risk management, then we need to have processes that are aligned, otherwise, I fear it will be a barrier. I fear we will be talking different languages. Tech is about plug and play. And the more we diverge, the more we're putting a barrier to ourselves to keeping up with those opportunities, And in that paper as well, I also spoke to the emerging discipline of reliability engineering within pharma companies, which that approach is designed to identify the key process points of control in our operations and to ensure that they do not fail, and they design engineering controls then to prevent those failures. And to me, this is living preventative risk management in our operations that you were referring to a moment ago. But I also fear these are happening outside the PQS. I don't see the PQS outreaching to these programs. And feed forward in my book that's mentioned in ICH Q10 is reliability engineering in many ways. So these divergences worry me. They really do. I think they will present challenges to that innovation you're talking about. And we will have different risk management systems from our innovation partners. And that is a worry. I'm rambling, Nuala, but you hit on one of my pet topics there. And set me off.
And actually, we kicked off on that at the very beginning of this week. Val and I are happening to be co-teaching an academic program on risk management. And one of the questions from the kickoff webinar with our students who come from all cross sections of industry was, will we be covering ISO 31000? And it's absolutely on the money. While there is. I recognize the value of having a white paper or a harmonized guideline that says, this is our approach and this is why it's important to our patients. When we look at our med device brethren, they're very well versed in using ISO standards, and you're absolutely right. I have a concern, and Karen called it out. Her conscience is calling it loud. We should be leveraging more on the excellent work that's there in terms of the ISO standards, particularly around this area of risk management, because they're well developed. They're very mature. So what's up next on our AMA Ask Me Anything episode? Well, you kicked a little bit of a mention there when in your address to KM and knowledge management to the ICH Q12 and looking at the emergence of QRM as a critical capability for organizations in managing their post-approval change. And of course, Q12 was published just before the pandemic in November 2019. And it sets out that framework for categorization of post-approval changes using a risk-based categorization. So there is an assumption here that it's absolutely integral, as you say. It's inherent in the DNA if you're going to manage these changes, if you're going to seek that regulatory flexibility. you're going to have to get your arms around doing, effective risk-based characterization, and to enable that communication between the MAH, the market authorization holder, and the regulatory authority. And as they state in Q12, it's important for the efficient use of industry and regulatory resources, because this gives us an opportunity to have some relief around the way in which those resources are applied, in terms of whether you're notifying before or after, whether, as the colloquialism is is it a do and tell or a tell and do. So what are your thoughts there? I know we've spoken about this previously with Marty Lippa, and indeed yourself, in the work that you guys have been doing about integrating QRM and KM. So talk to us a little bit about those PAC changes and your thoughts there.
Well, you're absolutely right. And for me, ICH Q12 is a really significant document. It sort of pulls a lot of things together. I think it was Janet Woodcock herself that said, one of the issues facing us all, particularly in relation to innovation, is we're locked into processes. So we perceive ourselves to be locked into processes when they're quite immature. So, ICH Q12 talks to, demonstrating how we increase our product and process knowledge and to enable us to understand the risks. So those two concepts are united in ICH Q12. And that's, I think, the unification point of those two. So, if we can demonstrate that we have, good development pathways for understanding ourselves and our processes through KM and QRM, then we can avail of those reliefs promised in ICH Q12. So yes, Marty and I have been working in the background on this, and we actually have a discussion paper out at the moment. It's up on the ISPE website. Maybe we should share that link also, I don't know. But we're exploring the practical applications of the RKI cycle, the risk knowledge infinity cycle. The Lippa loop, as I think you called it when you were on with Marty. Yeah. It's affectionate name to those who know it well. And I should mention, actually, contributing to that paper, which I call a discussion paper, a stimuli for discussion, I think would be a good way of framing that particular paper. It's not a peer review paper, it's more a let's talk about this. But co-authoring that is Dr. O'Donnell again, and again, our mentor in the PRST, and Green. And Nuala, I suppose I should say, we've arrived at this point with contributors like yourself. I mean, I know you've put in a lot of work into KM and understanding it. And Marty, you've been on a long journey together. I'm just hopping in at the last episode of the series, if you like. But we have looked at how useful the RKI cycle might be when you're considering change in particular, and how you might use it to determine, as you just said, the reliability of what you know, and how you might use it to identify what you don't know, but really do need to know if you want to make a good decision here. So it brings together the knowledge you need to inform your QRM and the knowledge you capture from your QRM, and how you relate these to decision making. And we looked at it in the context of different types of changes. We tried to look at practical implementation if the change was innovative, if it was an improvement, or even if it was, as you mentioned, a reactive change because some risk control has failed. And we're convinced it's a helpful approach. We're convinced it's a compass, to establish your starting point and your direction when you're making a journey towards big decisions that relate and impact risk steps in our process. There's an old saying, I think, which goes, if you want to go there, I wouldn't start from here. When we think our loop would help, orientate where you start so that you have the knowledge, understanding, and the risk assurance, you need to make a change decisions. And they're the things you need to demonstrate effectiveness of, to be able to, when you invite the regulator to trust you to make changes.
Yeah, for sure. And of course, we must remember that I agree with you, by the way. I absolutely love Q12. It's one of the documents, even though it's had a troubled past.
It's a hard read.
Yeah, it's a hard read. And, it certainly hasn't sunk in to any extent in the industry, over the course of the pandemic. So it's going to be a bit of a slow burn. And of course, not only is it a hard read, and then we've had the problem within the European community of having a difficulty in terms of the legislation in Europe. But I guess effectively, it's worth saying to people, find a way to access an article about Q12 or something, even if you can't face into the full document plus the 2 annexes that are there, because the potential here is quite simple. There's a very lovely little flow chart, and I'm a great one for visualizing concepts. There's a lovely little flow chart in Q12 that talks about why would you want to do this, and it literally establishes this established conditions, this concept of what an established condition, which is the legally binding information necessary to assure your product quality, part of your control strategy and part of your regulatory submission. And therefore, you do a very quick analysis of the change that we're about to do. Does it impact an established condition? Yes or no? And they refer to established conditions such as a critical process parameter or some such thing. And if the answer is no, it's not an established condition, away you go. There's no need to report it. Off you go, manage it within your PQS system. And you do that through your own internal change management or change control system. So that's a very nice way to start your change control system, to say, we have evaluated that this does not impact a critical process parameter or a critical quality attribute or one of our now defined established conditions. However, if the answer to that is yes, then you have to go further. And that's where you need to get into your risk categorization skills. And of course, you have to base that on knowledge. And that's the piece where, if there is a risk that the criticality of this parameter change could present a risk to your product quality. If that risk is high, then you're definitely into prior approval notification with your regulators, and that's a clear pathway. But if you deem it to be low or even moderate, and that you can demonstrate that you have a mechanism to control that and that you understand the implications of that, you can actually go ahead and just do that change and do notification to the regulators, and they will review your justification for that the next time they pop in to visit you. So there's a huge gate of opportunity there in terms of regulatory relief. It's only one of those pathways on the flow chart that you're absolutely into that prior approval position. So I really, really hope that much more. I know it came just at the beginning of the pandemic. It really hasn't had enough air and light shone on it yet. So I do hope that happens as we get back to meeting face to face and seeing real people again, instead of all these podcasts and web access. So now that we're talking about Q12 or ICH guidance, what's happening with the analytical lifecycle management, ICH Q14, which happens to be, this sounds like a friends and family edition of AMA, because it happens to be under the rapporteurship of another respected colleague and dear friend of ours, Dr. Yukio Hiyama, who has visited Dublin many times with us from Japan. I know the original schedule, I don't know whether it's been impacted by pandemic or whatever, but original schedule in their business plan was that we would see a step 4 in spring of 2021. We haven't seen that as yet. But what we have seen is USP 1220, and that has emerged for comment and has clearly placed QRM central to the development and implementation of those robust analytical methods, and particularly the more technologically advanced analytical methods that weren't really being managed under the current ICH Q2 and others. What's your thoughts, Val?
Well, I think the contents of ICH Q14, while we're still awaiting it in some ways, are well flagged. And even that USP chapter, which, went live last week, I think, we've had a lot of discussion and stimuli articles. And again, the content was well flagged to us. And again, the dots are joining up as far as I'm concerned. I love when a plan comes together. When you think about it, there are so many of our process controls that are informed by or confirmed by lab analysis, And this analysis informs so many of the decisions we make with respect to product quality. So to support that, we need to understand the reliability of those methods. And just like we saw in process validation, people might be more familiar with this analogy where, we moved from IQ, PQ, PQ, to the 3 stages of process validation, where we're looking at the same approach now to methods. So, good methods will be the output of good design. That's stage 1. Robust methods are the output of good qualification strategies. That's stage 2. And finally, the reliable methods will have a stage 3 continuous verification step, which may be the same as the system suitabilities we run with those methods. But probably, and as you mentioned, for complex methods, it's going to be system suitability plus, And, we need to know when our analysis is in control. More importantly, we need to know when it's out of control or unreliable. And biological analysis in particular can be very variable.
Yeah.
So QRM, I suppose, good QRM applications and good QRM tools, they will help us control what we can control. They will identify the controllable and help us to control it and help us to recognize when we're out of control and identify improvements to assure reliability. We need to know scientifically, that all these tests are, actually scientifically, to mention it, scientific results are always reported with a plus or minus whatever. That's the uncertainty factor, and with respect to the result. And this ICH Q14 is inviting us to understand that uncertainty factor on an ongoing basis, to react when it's too broad, to improve it if it's too, consistently wide, and particularly if the measure is critical to patient outcomes. I think no one of these ICHs has the patient at the center, but I think when you unite them and put them together, they are quite patient-centric documents. And I think your tune is eventually being played, Nuala, there, that these will bring these together. So our QRM tools and approaches, huge applications here.
Yeah, and actually, I loved the fact that the USP chapter, the 1220 chapter, it had 2 really simple, low formality risk tools in their chapter. They had a lovely little fishbone Ishikawa, and they had a really nice little heat map, a very simple checklist, and a heat map. So it was great to see very low formality but simple to use risk assessment tools embedded within the chapter. So I was delighted to see that. So listen, we're nearly at an end, but just to give you a whistle-stop tour from my side of the fence, it might be worth chatting about the evolution of the Quality Metrics Initiative that's been around for a number of years, and I've been a member of the research team with the St. Gallen University, Professor Friedley and his team, doing quality metrics research for FDA, and we published 3 reports. Definitely not even bedtime reading there for those of you. But the outcome of that is that we've seen a move away from these 3 metrics that was originally these 3 golden bullets that were going to determine a risk surveillance of the entire landscape, from generics and oral solid dosage all the way up to cell and gene therapy, which of course was aspirational to begin with. But by digging into those, the concept of this quality management maturity has emerged, and we saw that coming through with an FDA report in 2019 on drug shortages, their drug shortage report. They did a really detailed analysis around root causes to drug shortages. And we started to see them use the term of quality management maturity. So this concept of maturity, of aspiring to advancing the maturity within the industry, of not sticking with the status quo, it really is back to that Q10 concept of continual improvement and innovation. And so this concept now is taking hold. We're seeing the FDA, we saw them at a conference last week. I saw a set of slides from Jennifer Maguire talking about this concept of quality management maturity and what does that mean? And it also luckily embraces this concept of quality culture on a site, which I do a lot of work around. But some of the industry response to that quality management maturity, which is exciting, is the ISPE have brought out an Advancing Pharmaceutical Quality Program, the APQ program. They're bringing out 5 guides in a series in total, 4 of them to match up with the ICH Q10 enablers, or sorry, the elements within Q10 around CAPA, around change management, around pharmaceutical product and quality monitoring. And as well as that, they're also moving on to look at management review and responsibilities, which starts to bring in some of the culture and starts to bring in some of that leadership. And then finally, we've been asked, I'm involved in this initiative, we've been asked to redraft the cultural excellence report that came out in 2017 within ISPE, and to produce that into a 5-step maturity model program as well. So there'll be 5: quality culture at the center and the 4 elements of Q10, with a 5-step maturity model with an assess, aspire, act and advance, a very much PDCA, plan, do, check, act approach. And this should help in the industry evaluate themselves to begin with, but then to aspire, what do we need to do if we want to move from a level 3 company to a level 4 company in our CAPA management, in our change control, in our change management? What are the aspects of the program and the behaviors and attributes that go around the people who manage that program? So I'm very excited. I think it will open the debate of moving beyond some of this, very rigid way that we can apply our current tools, that kind of one and done. We have a tool for that. We don't need anything else. So that's very interesting. One thing you mentioned, Val, just to close on, the PICS, there's a new Aide memoir on assessing QRM.
Yeah, PICS have, again, because COVID and things are happening quietly. There are 2 quite significant PICS documents that were issued recently. One in 2019 on, the use of QRM in evaluating change. And then there's another one, an Aide memoir on evaluating your quality risk management system. And, potentially that will be used by site inspectors. So it'd be very useful to do a little health check on yourself using that Aide memoir also. So, just to highlight those as well, that they're in the landscape also.
Yeah, listen, we'll include links to those as well. So look, we're going to close out today. Any last thoughts or issues, Val, before we close?
No, I just think it's great that, we're walking the walk and talking the talk now, and we're not just, a 1 and 3 year visit from a regulator measures and monitors what quality is about. It's going to be real living metrics, real living data, looking at real life systems. I feel we're living through a very significant juncture in terms of how pharmaceutical quality is managed. And it's an exciting time to be part of it, if you like. And I think when you look at it in the whole, that the patient is in the middle. The patient is safe when our products are safe, and the more we understand about how to keep them safe, the better the output will probably be. So it's very exciting times, and thanks for inviting me along to talk about it.
Absolutely brilliant. We'll be doing another one of these Ask Me Anything questions. You're a font of knowledge as usual. Stacey, back to you.
I love it. Nuala, before we wrap today, can you just quickly give us a rundown for our listeners of the key takeaways from today, things that will be included in the resources?
Yeah, it's a party special. We're going to have to do a bibliography for all the links we have today, but just a few of them we'll link into some of the previous podcasts from Val and Marty. We'll link to the ICH Q9 revision update and to Val's ISO divergence article and all the other goodies that we've peppered throughout this. There'll be a whole host of goodies to take away from this episode. So thanks a lot to everybody.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to our risk revolutionaries, Val and Nuala, a very special episode. Remember, the questions and answers don't need to stop here, so please email or message our team with your risk questions to be addressed in a later episode. And while we're doling out sentiments, I also want to give a big shout out to our producer, Ben Kitchen. And lastly, we send our thanks to you, our valued listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, we ask you to subscribe in your podcast player of choice so you never miss one. And don't forget to share with your friends, colleagues, and online networks. If you have topic requests or guest suggestions, we'd love to hear from you about that as well. And for today's show notes, including links to a whole list of takeaways and other information on this podcast, please visit www.ivtnetwork.com/podcast. We'll be back again next week with another great interview. Until then, stay healthy and safe.